This is the second video on the nature and origin of anxiety. This is a topic that has always fascinated me, and I've done a lot of research to understand its origination. We speak today of what we call hydrophobia or agoraphobias or exposure anxiety. All these anxieties have a source. They have a beginning. It is my interest in finding the roots of such emotional problems. This is therefore the second installment on this topic. I'd like to go again to find the roots of these emotional structures into prehistory. In my previous video, I offered the theory that many emotional illnesses of contemporary man can be traced to that period in prehistory when our hominid ancestors lived in abject terror because they were hunted as preys to many beasts. Acute anxiety, paranoia, became psychological alert systems to keep those hominids sharp, acute, and extremely vigilant. Those who survived the pursuit of predators for thousands of years passed on to us those anxiety and paranoid genes. And now we are stuck with these traits, which are the cause of so many personal, collective, and historical conflicts. In my last video, I described mostly those traits, those psychological defenses the early men, our ancestors, designed to stay alert in the wilderness of Africa. In this present video, I will continue hypothetically the next phase as hominids, as hunters, and the next targets after the animals, a war they were starting to win. But after thousands of years as hunters, the hunting party had become an organized force that now was used against hominids. This hypothesis is inspired by the ideas of a brilliant anthropologist from New York, Barbara Ehrenreich, in her book Blood Rights, which I recommend you to read. Anthropologists do ask, why did the Neanderthal disappear? Well, I present a theory which is shocking and disturbing, but I believe that Homo sapiens ate them. We are not told by anthropologists and paleoanthropologists that our ancestors were cannibals. Yes, we Homo sapiens abducted Neanderthals, kidnapped, abducted their women, mated with them, and ate men, women, and children of that other tribe. Like the New York Times motto at the end of every edition, all the news that's fit to print. Well, the ugly truth is not fit to print, so it doesn't get revealed. This is our Western mind at work. Everything is a euphemism. Many humanoid species coexisted thousands of years, and then one by one became extinct, and the Homo sapiens species prevailed. Why did all the other species die out? I believe they were exterminated by Homo sapiens. When cats were introduced in Australia, they wiped out several species of birds. Zoological forms are by nature genocidal. Homo sapiens decimated, mated, and devoured other hominids at a scale that is unprecedented. Those hominids who were at first arboreal, living in trees, having been forced to leave the safety of the trees and being forced to walk on the surface of the earth, had to supplement their vegetarian diet that had shrunk by becoming carnivorous. It was a necessity for survival. So now they had become what we call omnivorous, with a varied diet: vegetarian, fructivorous, and carnivorous. A red meat diet with its rich concentration of protein strengthened them and nourished their brain. The brain was being given prime nutrients for its growth, expansion, and it accelerated the functioning of the brain. Maybe that's why some hominid species had a larger brain than ours, like the Homo rudolfensis, discovered in Kenya in 2012, which had a larger brain than previous hominids. In 1910, what was known as the Boskop man, also known as Homo capensis, was discovered near Bosco, South Africa. Had a brain estimated at 1,980 cubic centimeters, compared to modern man, whose brain is about 1,400 cubic centimeters. After thousands of years as the hunted, these bipedal hominids were becoming the hunters, preying at first on small mammals, sea and sky creatures, then on the beasts of prey that used to terrorize them for thousands of years. Didn't God in Genesis tell men, "You shall have dominion over all the beasts on earth"? That is in the Bible. Then these hominids turned their murderous hunting skills on other hominids different from them and on their own species who looked like them. Homo sapiens had become the scourge of Homo sapiens. The Latin saying homo homini lupus says it all. Man is a wolf to man. These words were spoken by the Roman playwright Plautus, 250 BC. These words were repeated by the philosopher Schopenhauer in 1820 in his book The World as Will and Idea, and by Freud. But no thinker stated this truth in such glaring way better than the French philosopher Joseph de Maistre in 1800, when he wrote, "Man's destructive hand spares nothing that lives. He kills to feed himself, he kills to adorn himself, he kills to attack, he kills to amuse himself, he kills for the sake of killing. He wants everything and nothing is away from his reach. His table is covered with corpses." I propose, therefore, that Homo sapiens, in the last 500,000 years, and even before that, have been the worst enemies to Homo sapiens, worse than all the beasts of prey that have been to hominids in all the last thousands of years. That's because, having mastered the art of hunting, they converted it to the art of war. There is a very little transition between the art of hunting to the art of war. It's a transition that is in fact quite logical and quite existential. The hunting party, which had become organized to catch prey to feed the tribes, had become the raiding party, which is an organization of few men, males, attacking another tribe, killing the males, abducting the females, and kidnapping the children, and all the goods that they had produced. Females were abducted, raped, then cooked. Prisoners were roasted and consumed. Every superior species devastates inferior species. That is the Darwinian law of survival. As late as 1515, the Aztecs waged savage wars to capture prisoners, to sacrifice them to their god of war, and chopping them to pieces and offering them to the urban population. In 1487, the Aztec king Ahuizotl, inaugurating the great temple at Tenochtitlan, modern-day Mexico City, sacrificed more than 80,000 captives for their god Huitzilopochtli, the sun god which required nourishment of freshly harvested human hearts. The Aztecs terrorized the neighboring tribes for captives to harvest human hearts. They needed constant supply of hearts. No wonder, when Hernando Cortés landed in Mexico, the victimized tribes of the area joined him immediately en masse against the Aztecs. 600 Spaniards could not have conquered the Aztec Empire and could not have subdued the capital Tenochtitlan without the assistance of an army of 30,000 Indians comprised of contingents of other tribes. It is also mind-boggling to me that a nation, Mexico, would name itself Mexico after the name of their most murderous tribe, the Aztecs, whose other name was Mexica. And what do you think happened to the 80,000 captives who had been sacrificed to their sun god? They were eaten by the inhabitants of Tenochtitlan. You can imagine what a feast of incredible proportions, a giant barbecue where thousands were roasted and consumed by a protein-hungry people. There are countless evidence the early hominids became cannibals once they mastered tools and fire. Among hominids, we have clear evidence. The Heidelberg man who was discovered in Germany was a hominid, was a cannibal, as burnt corpses were uncovered at the excavation site. Cannibalistic sacrifices were traditional among many tribes in the Pacific Melanesia, including the Maoris of the Hawaiian archipelago. Hominids were part of the menus of the bipedal hominids as they competed with other hominids. Homo sapiens vanquished other hominids. In their conquest of the animal kingdom, Homo sapiens' inventiveness became remarkable. Two new weapons of extraordinary significance and far-reaching consequences accelerated the demise of the other species. The invention of the spear thrower first, and then the bow, which made early hominids, in particular Homo sapiens, long-distance, accurate killers. In 1910, the Belgian novelist Rosny, in his novel La Guerre du Feu, became the topic of a movie entitled The Quest for Fire, directed by French-Canadian Jean-Jacques Hano. You should see the movie. It's still, I believe it's in Netflix or some other channel. In this movie, there is a description of the encounter of a group of Neanderthals in search of fire, traveling the land to find a burning tree that had been hit by lightning, so they could capture the fire and bring it to their tribes. In that search for fire, they encounter a group of cannibalistic hominids carrying a Homo sapien girl for roasting. They liberate the girl, who teaches them how to make fire, how to use that formidable weapon, the spear thrower, and introduce them to a new style of lovemaking, the missionary position. What I find interesting is the depiction of the three different species living in the same time zone in that territory, in that time of history, or rather prehistory. Homo sapiens coexisted. It was a matter of time before the Homo sapiens ruled the earth without rival. The interspecies and their intertribal wars that blemished the prehistory became the first Holocaust in history. The en masse slaughter of hominids and animals marked our prehistory, but no anthropologist talks about it. It is too dreadful to conjure, too ghastly to visualize. Yet, in the 20th century, we are the survivors and witnesses of racial wars of immense proportions, which proves my theory that these traits have not vanished. that they still persist and in fact affect and determine what we call history. This theory of history is beyond the economic theory, the Marxist theory of history, of patriotism, and all other concepts which have been used to explain historical conflicts. It is something that we are presenting here. We are proposing that the massacre described in written history have precedence in prehistory. World War II was the blatant interspecies war, the racial war par excellence. The refined expression ethnic cleansing was the euphemism for racial extermination. Whether it is the decimation of Jews, Slavs, or Gypsies by the Nazis, the purging of the Chinese race in 1937-38, the massacre of Nanjing, where 300,000 Chinese civilians were raped and decapitated by the Japanese soldiers with the consent of their superiors, or the genocidal mass slaughter of 1 million Tutsis by the Hutus' majority government from April to July 1994, where 70% of the Tutsi population and 30% of the Pygmy population was decimated in that Holocaust known as the Rwandan massacre. It's interesting that even the Pygmies, were decimated, 30% of them. It gives you a sense of the racial structure of this kind of event. Or the Armenian tragedy, the slaughter of 1.5 Armenians killed by Turkish troops in 1915. We must understand how early this concept of genocide was. One of the first written documents on the superiority of race and ensuing ethnic editing, we find it in the Bible, in the Old Testament, Joshua chapter 6, section 20. God helps the Israelites destroy Jericho, killing, quote, men, women, young, old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, section 32 to 35, God orders the Israelites to kill everyone in Hebron, including the children. In Deuteronomy chapter 3, section 3 to 7, God orders them to kill everyone in Bashan. In the book Numbers, chapter 31, section 7 to 18, the Israelites kill the Midianites, all except the virgins they take as spoils of war. In the book of Samuel, chapter 15, section 1 to 9, God orders the slaughter of the Amalekites, etc. There is so much more in the Holy Scripture that is truly terrifying. And then in the 19th century, theories of racial superiorities proposed by educated Europeans began to blossom. Darwin and his philosophy, Darwinism, came to the rescue, defending racial extermination. Darwinism, applied to races, leads to ethnic cleansing, following the precepts of the survival of the fittest. He was an Englishman, well aware of the superiority of his race. In his classic book, The Descent of Men, Darwin writes, quote, the civilized races of men will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. The most important words here, will almost certainly exterminate. How true. The poem of Rudyard Kipling, The White Man's Burden, illustrates what we are talking about. Now, Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, in 1883 coined the word eugenics. He advocated strategies for improving human stock to give the most suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of success. His idea of negative eugenics was designed to restrict the reproduction of less fit populations. This philosophy eventually fed the policies of sterilizations followed by the Nazi Party in Germany and Sweden. Eugenics is that propellant which explains many wars in early and late history. It explains the slaughter of civilians when in wars cities are conquered. Women and children are raped and they attempt to become a sovereign nation without a European or European master. The indigenous, the massacred are prevented from repopulating. Repopulation of the defeated ones becomes an important part of war. That explains why civilians are killed. So the reproduction is affected by the loss of so many women. This is a point that nobody has taken and nobody mentions. Thus we see in the sack of Rome in 326 the massacre of the population. We see that in the taking of Constantinople in 1453, or the fire bombings of Tokyo, or nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the 3 months aerial bombardment of London by the Germans in World War II. The same ethnic fever fuels many wars, and this is something that has to be addressed, whether it is the bombing of Dresden and Stuttgart or the artillery destruction of Stalingrad or the massacre of the Nanjing citizen by the Japanese. Eugenics is the unspoken motive, never acknowledged, always camouflaged under political and military jargon. And I'm saying this mass murder of women and children is an attempt to eradicate the other race. The enemy, Hitler, with his blatant bluntness, was outspoken about it. It was his undertaking to delete the Jews and the Slavs. So everyone is guilty because that unconscious urge lies dormant in everyone unconscious because we have inherited it from our prehistory. We modern humans have to acknowledge and integrate that prehistorical trauma. We have amnesia about prehistory and the trauma of racial slaughter perpetrated by all our ancestors on a mass scale. The prehistoric tradition of racial annihilation is perpetuated in history. But now we have evidence of such horror. Recorded history is replete with large massacres of civilians perpetrated by historical figures. We celebrate Alexander, which we call the Great, was a killer of immense proportions. The Greek city of Thebes was burned to the ground and its 30,000 population put to the sword. In the Fertile Crescent, the King Sargon, Nebuchadnezzar, Joshua, Attila, Genghis Khan, Hulagu, Napoleon, Kaiser William II, Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, and the list goes on. We humans got used to it and even to some degree expect it. We have inherited the genocidal gene that lies dormant in all of us and can be awakened. A thin armor prevents us from erupting that genocidal rage towards other races around us. Racism has a long history, and that homicidal energy resides in all of us. Let's remember that World War I was ignited by the virulent racism that existed between Slavs, which means Serbians and Russians, and the Germanic races. This is something, of course, that we have forgotten. Thus, what I presented in this video document is the core racism that we modern humans have inherited from prehistory and from the early thousands of years of the hominids, where intertribal wars existed, where massacres were perpetrated for thousands and thousands of years. A lot of our anxieties, our fear, our dread of the other, our xenophobia, our hydrophobia, our agoraphobias can be traced to that period in prehistory. In the next document video, I will become more focused on some of these anxieties in the individual. Exposure anxiety, hydrophobia, and agoraphobia. Thank you.